Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Week's digital show, Washington Week Recommends. I'm Yamiche Alcindor, and each week I recommend great reporting that I think deserves your attention. And today I want to highlight a new piece in the Washington Post from their Justice Department and Civil Rights reporter, David Nakamura. The headline of this story is, quote, Trump-Biden probes draw more notice, but Garland has boosted focus on civil rights. The piece, of course, is a deep dive into the Attorney General's efforts to broaden how civil rights issues are viewed and addressed by the entire Justice Department. It also features interviews with Attorney General Merrick Garland and some of his top deputies. And David, of course, joins me now. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to Washington Week Recommends. I want to start by reading part of your interview with Attorney General Merrick Garland. He told you this about why he wanted to get back into government. He said, quote, I'm seeing people die. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, all of whom are clearly having their constitutional rights violated right in front of everybody. And I'm sitting as a passive judge, which is the job of a judge. It's the pandemic, so I'm doing this mostly from my attic, and I just feel like if you see injustice, you should do something about it, and sitting there alone didn't seem to be enough. He was, of course, referring to Black people killed by police or in racially charged or racially divisive incidents that sparked protests during the summer of 2020 and beyond. Talk to me a bit about what really is motivating Attorney General Merrick Garland to take this new focus on civil rights as he's dealing with all these other issues as well.
Well, I was talking to him and his deputies, and they make the point that, and Garland made the point to me that, he was offered this job as President Biden's Attorney General before the January 6th insurrection, and that I think he was announced the day of January 6th that he would take the job, but that he had been offered before it, and that has been all consuming in terms of public attention, this investigation that his department has launched into that, of course, assault on the Capitol. He recognizes the high stakes, of course. And he said, it's very important. It's obviously an assault on democracy. That's a big priority. But he said, and you read the quote, that he had been considering getting back into public life in part because of the protests in the summer and fall of 2020 and the big outpouring of the concerns of Black Lives Matter and other advocates for greater justice and equity in the criminal justice system. And so he said, look, I've made this a priority from day one in the department. I think what's interesting is what I sensed in my interviews is that there's a little bit of frustration, not that, of course, the January 6th investigation and investigations into Trump's handling of documents and now Biden is not important. That's extremely important. They continue to stress that, but that it's overshadowed a lot of this other work. And, we talked about this in the story about a news conference in late November, which I think you were at, Yamiche, may have even asked a question, in which he talked not only about the prosecution victory in the January 6th trial of the Oath Keepers who were found guilty of conspiracy, but also made a point during that to also talk about the department's efforts in Jackson, Mississippi, and the ongoing water crisis there, and a victory that the Justice Department had won in getting a monitor put into that situation. So I think that is kind of what is continuing to sort of drive the AG to continue to want to talk about civil rights, even as he's focused on these other things.
And David, I do remember that press conference very clearly. I asked him about the Jackson water crisis and the action there. They had filed a complaint against the city, and they also pushed for a third party to take over the water system in that city. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what this focus on civil rights looks like. I asked you, of course, at the beginning of this about what's driving him, but really, what does this look like at the DOJ?
They stress that, this could be kind of dry language, but this idea that he's asked departments outside of the Civil Rights Division, which the Justice Department, it's a broad division within the Justice Department, headed by, of course, Kristen Clark, a sort of a longtime civil rights advocate and former, civil rights lawyer. That department is sort of primed to deal with civil rights cases, but they're saying we want to go beyond that. And, the biggest issue that we talked about with him is, throughout the last 2 years really is the issues around policing, and which was, of course, stemmed the racial justice protests in 2020. So there's a lot of issues around policing and dealing with police use of force. But the cases that the Justice Department is looking at is very broad. And so in the story, we talk about efforts not only, of course, with environmental justice. There's a new Office of Environmental Justice, but they have new programs around redlining initiative, where they've won a number of large settlements, and even recently just announced a $31 million settlement around a redlining case, which was the largest ever for the federal government in sort of forcing banks to deal with inequities in sort of lending. But and I think this is the big thing that's happening right now is, of course, there's all these sort of new pressures around voting rights and abortion and other issues that the department is trying to deal with. And I think one of the tensions is, how much authority the federal government has. And so you're seeing Garland try to respond to some of the issues around voting rights and abortion with new initiatives, both lawsuits in specific cases. There's an abortion case in Idaho the Justice Department is involved in. They've sued Texas, Georgia, and other states around voting rights. But also he's tried to sort of create a broader sense within the department of trying to find ways to get at some of these problems that don't necessarily involve straight litigation, but other sort of community involvement, other things. And it's not easy. And I think there's some questions in the community about, the pace of federal efforts can be somewhat slow and ponderous. And I think there's obviously a need for urgency.
Certainly a need for urgency. When you talk about the people who are supporting Garland's actions here, I want to, before I ask you more about what the DOJ is doing, I want to go back to sort of what is driving Attorney General Garland. His family has a history with the Holocaust. From my understanding, his grandmother immigrated to the United States to escape the Holocaust. Her siblings were killed there. What more can you tell us just about his family background and his personal conviction for this?
He talks about it quite a bit, and he at times gets emotional in public. And you figure someone who's talked about it, of course, it's an emotional thing to talk about, but someone who talks about it quite a bit as part of his getting into a career in law enforcement to begin with. You think that he would be able to sort of speak in public without necessarily getting emotional because he's done it so often. But he does get emotional. I did ask him about that, and he tends to sort of, even though he has some moments where he does talk about his family, he doesn't want to make it about himself necessarily. But I did say, look, you have to be concerned about the rise in hate crimes, the concern about the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism again, which is a big part of the sort of national conversation right now, what's happening with the far right movement and other issues. And he did say, look, I'm very concerned about hate crimes for all groups that are being targeted, Asians and LGBT and so on. But I did then ask him, I said, look, the former president, I know you can't talk about your investigations, but he had, my interview with him was only 2 weeks after former President Trump had dinner with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes, the white supremacist. And I did ask him how he felt about it. Now, he didn't directly answer that, but, he is very, people have talked to me about it, has said, look, it's very personal to him. This issue of persecution of minority groups based on their beliefs and so on. And you see that he went to, of course, the national Hanukkah menorah lighting and spoke about the need for the country to get together and fight hate. The department had a big conference in early December on the 65th anniversary of the founding of the Civil Rights Division, in which they not only had Democrats, come and talk about it, but also Republican administration officials from the Trump administration even to talk about this is something that every Justice Department needs to deal with. Of course, the Trump administration looked at civil rights in a different prism and prioritized different things. And that's part of what you're seeing with Garland is sort of regenerating some of these things that have happened during the Obama administration, the priorities there. But I think there's a big call from civil rights groups. You got to go beyond that, given some of the pressures facing the country right now.
Well, you're talking about what civil rights groups are thinking, and while some of them, of course, are saying that he deserves credit, that he's doing a great job, there are some are saying that they're frustrated at the pace that the DOJ is going at this. Talk a bit about their criticism, while also, of course, welcoming the idea that civil rights is sort of back on the agenda.
I mean, what's interesting is, I talked to folks over the past couple of years who said, look, given the outpouring of 2020, they had really, these are some of the black civil rights leaders said, we wanted to have a black attorney general, given sort of that really prioritize some of these issues, understand the community's pain in a real personal way. And they weren't sure about Garland. But, under Garland, you have Vanita Gupta, who ran the Civil Rights Division in the Obama era, is now the #3 official. You have Kristen Clark, I mentioned before, who runs the Civil Rights Division, very steeped in civil rights issues. The community, the civil rights leaders, and I think this, Yamiche, they feel comforted by that. They speak each other's language. They've worked together. But there is concern. I've written stories about, this idea the federal government, one of the biggest levers they have on policing, for example, is what's called the pattern and practice investigation, which is a big federal investigation into the entire police force that's going on right now in Minneapolis and Louisville and a number of other cities. But these things take years to even finalize. These things have been going on already since the spring of 2021. There's no decisions yet in any of these cases or these investigations. And then even the reforms could take years after that. And people are saying, well, we need to move quickly. Another example is Garland announced a voting rights a task force to look at election threats to election officials. And they sent out a number of more monitors to polls in the midterms. And I think there's been concern that the Justice Department has looked into 1,000 reports of intimidation and abuse of election officials, and they've brought 9 federal cases, which is not a great number. And there's an idea they're not being willing to be aggressive enough. Part of what I hear is the federal government in particular, when they want to devote resources to a case, they want a winner, and that they're going to look for cases that, might be you consider a slam dunk, or one where they're really going to make an impact and send a broader message, but that they might be, hesitant to sort of take risks. And, I talked to former prosecutors who said that makes sense given the sort of number of things the federal government's dealing with. But others are saying, look, there's new threats around, disinformation to suppress minority voting online, debates around the teaching of critical race theory, and some areas trying to ban that, where the DOJ could be helpful in maybe litigating some of these cases. They're not doing that yet. And so there is frustration even among the civil rights groups that I've talked to that the DOJ could be doing more.
And you mentioned that the word resources. As part of your article, you wrote that there are civil rights leaders as well as people within the DOJ that are a little worried about whether or not things might get stretched too thin because there are so much things to do if you're focused on civil rights. What's your reporting reveal on that issue?
Well, that came up on a number of folks who said, look, to have a task force on voting rights and a task force on abortion and be doing the new initiative around redlining. These are important things. You have an Office of Environmental Justice, Office of Access to Justice has been restored after the Trump administration got rid of that, where you're giving legal help to folks who without the means necessarily to be able to gain it otherwise. These are important things, but each of these offices needs attention and budget and staff. And they don't all have it. And, again, this is going on at the time of course, the investigations into the former president, and even, of course, now the Biden's handling of classified documents. But beyond that, a lot of other priorities. Crimes rising in cities, Justice Department under pressure to deal with that. They have guns initiatives to get illegal guns off the street. Today, Merrick Garland just spoke about fentanyl to the U.S. Mayor's Conference. I just was watching that. His whole speech was about the DOJ's efforts around fentanyl, illicit fentanyl trafficking. So there's a lot of issues around budgeting and how much money the DOJ can put to each of these things. And the fact that the Republicans now control the House, there will be questions about spending and programs and priorities. And, conservatives I've talked to, they have other priorities around civil rights, and they've have complaints about Garland's, for example, dropping a Trump administration stance in affirmative action cases against Yale and other Ivy League schools in their admission policies. And so, there's going to be a lot of tensions around not just the Congress's look at what Garland's doing around these probes into January 6th, but also I suspect there'll be some look at some of the things around policing and other things that the Justice Department is doing on civil rights.
And of course, you mentioned a critical part of this, which is that Republicans now control the House. You wrote as part of your article, conservatives have greeted Garland's efforts with indignation, saying the department is selectively enforcing the law based on liberal political agendas. Civil rights leaders said Garland and his team deserve credit for restoring a sense of mission after the Trump administration pursued far fewer civil rights investigations. So talk about the tension there. You have civil rights leaders who are saying this is great news, but then you have Republicans with new power in Washington saying this is possibly going a step too far. And they, of course, are pledging some investigations here, as you just said.
Each Democratic and Republican administration, even, of course, though there's supposed to be a firewall between the White House and the DOJ politically, they're going to have different priorities. And the DOJ folks I talked to say they also have policy priorities. That Garland called the Supreme Court ruling in the Dobbs case, I can't remember the exact wording, but basically said it was a big blow to women reproductive freedom, right? And so, and I talked to folks that, look, we have policy goals on some of these to expand these kind of rights. But Republicans and the Trump administration, like I said, they supported cops and police on the ground in terms of cases against particular policing, and they had different priorities, again, around affirmative action and other areas. They also saw a lot of efforts that this DOJ and the Obama DOJ did as federal overreach into sort of policing in other areas, and they sort of banned efforts within the Justice Department under Jeff Sessions to go that far. And so some of that is a natural sort of give and take about the political agenda of each administration. But I think what you're seeing now is the civil rights leaders saying, look, the basic reason for the Civil Rights Division within the Justice Department is to protect those who've been marginalized. And this is restoring that sense of mission. Garland often talks about the creation of the Justice Department in the 1870s during the Reconstruction to protect Black Americans against persecution as the founding mission. He often talks about that. So you have those tensions. And I think what you're seeing now, what you will see from Republicans is saying these guys are going too far. One thing that was pointed out to me was efforts around voting rights. Republicans are saying, look, I mentioned before that liberal activists are saying, hey, they're not doing enough on investigating some of these threats to election officials. Republicans are saying they're not doing enough that much because there isn't really a crisis here. That this is overblown. That they're going after Republicans. They also pointed to abortion, where this Justice Department is I think indicted 25 people in 5 different cases on what's called the FACE Act, which is blocking access to abortion or reproductive rights clinics. And they've prosecuted a number of people on that. Republicans are saying, or conservatives I talked to say, they're not investigating a number of sort of attacks or arson or attacks on religious institutions and sort of pro-life, family counseling centers that have happened in the past couple of years. And so they're saying, look, they're selectively enforcing what the DOJ is going to prioritize. And so I think you're going to hear a number of public hearings talk about this. The 2 women I mentioned who are running high-level positions inside the department who have this civil rights background, they didn't get very many votes, maybe one vote apiece from the Senate for their confirmation. So I think they're going to be on the Hill again, answering questions from Republicans who are going to be pretty tough in their questioning.
Well, certainly a story and attention will keep covering the DOJ versus House GOP versus God knows what else will be going out there. I will tell you, thank you so much for coming on. It was so important to share your reporting. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of reporting to be done on the DOJ and the probes into President Biden and into former President Trump. But this is such a critical part of it, especially as we just celebrated the birthday of Martin Luther King. So thank you so much, David, for coming on.
Yamiche, thank you. You cover this as well as anybody, so I appreciate the time.
Thank you. And thanks, of course, to all of you for watching Washington Week Recommends. You can find us here every single Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And tonight, be sure, of course, to tune in to Washington Week on PBS. We'll discuss a lot, including the latest on President Biden's handling of classified documents, the U.S. hitting its debt limit, and increasing threat of political violence. See you this evening. Thanks for watching.